Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 28th of August. We're looking once again at updates from the Vodyane front and also Vuhledar. We'll then move on to Selydove and Pokrovsk and look in granular detail at elevation dynamics at the line of contact. We're going to focus on that primarily. We're going to look at some really important changes, and also we're going to go through the troop disposition for both sides, and I'll give a general estimate of what both sides should be having in terms of manpower, at least on paper. And then after that, we'll look at New York and Toretsk. So let's zoom in and look at the advances over the past 24 hours. And I shouldn't have this yellow polygon marked anymore in yellow. It should be marked in red because this is an advance from 2 days ago. But looking at the actual advances that have unfolded over the past 24 hours, you'll see that the Russian forces have been able to clear out additional fields located either south or southeast of the highway that connects Konstantinivka, which is now under Russian control, as you may know, to Vuhledar, which is coming under serious pressure at this point. And you could see that it's coming from multiple axes. First of all, as we know, the Russian forces have recently been stepping up their game of consolidating control over fortified positions, including trenches and these pillboxes. Also, of course, tree lines going through, sifting, taking control over them, positioning themselves in a way that would be favorable for then advancing towards Vodyane. But at the same time, they've also advanced a bit southwards and taken over this region over here, about 3.2 square kilometers. The Russian forces are advancing along a higher elevated area because you have this diagonal ridge, which is basically running along these two parallel red lines. And then it crosses through the Yuzhno-Donbasskaya coal mine here. There's a really large slag heap nearby, and it's basically on even footing, I'd say, with the Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar, which are some of the highest elevated positions in this entire theater. The Ukrainians here, even though their flanks are so compromised and they really do have dubious logistical basically standing at this point, just based on the fact that their garrison here is so well entrenched, it prevents any sort of Russian attempt at frontally assaulting them. Whenever they did that over a year and a half ago, it yields very high casualties. And so the Russians at this point, they're focusing on squeezing them out by going from the flanks first, which includes, for instance, this mine over here. So the Russians are now, if we're going to measure it, really close to reaching the intersection. So it's 1.2 kilometers. And then to the west, they've also been able to clear out a large chunk of territory west of Pavlivka, which is, first of all, help the Russians expand their depth in this region near the village, which will then allow them to, of course, advance northwards past the local highway here marked in red and begin to put pressure from the western flank on Vuhledar, which is something that hasn't really happened. There are some trenches in this area in the X that should be marked on the map but aren't, so the Ukrainians do have a certain level of defensive density here. In terms of the garrison that the Ukrainians have, it's mainly 72nd Brigade, but this unit has a lot of responsibilities across a broader part of the front line, not just this one town. And so then on the western flank, you could say you also have some level of involvement from the 58th Motorized Brigade, although of course it's only partial because other elements of this unit are defending around the Velika Novostilka sector. To zoom in, the Russian forces took over, 14 square kilometers. So this is a rather large chunk of territory. It is largely on a lower lying area, but there are some protruding heights, I believe, such as this one over here that is located southwest of Pavlivka. But yeah, for the most part, it is the low-lying region. It is an area that is really, really dangerous for any sort of Ukrainian troops to be spotted in or to be manning static defenses. And so the Ukrainian forces in this region, they are closer to Prestivka, and in recent days they have been mentioning Russian pressure generally in that direction. So again, when you're looking at it, with the pressure going on towards Vodyane, with the attempts to take over the coal mine, this is all being positioned in a way that would force the Ukrainians out. Because again, when you talk about the logistical situation, Bohoya-Valenka, there's not really a solid paved road connecting between that and Vuhledar. Of course, you have the fields to go through, but now they're coming under increasingly heavy Russian bombardment. A lot of these areas are located on lower elevation, and the fall of Vuhledar eventually, what it would lead to is just this massive Russian height coming under their control, and all the other ones, of course, nearby, like the coal mine. And that would give them just a perfect view to go through this large swath of fields where the Ukrainians don't have prepared defensive positions, all the way to the next line of villages where there actually are defendable areas, but that's already 10 kilometers northwards. And so Vuhledar basically acts as a key to unlock so many other regions here that are at a really deep depth towards areas that would previously be considered as a part of Ukraine's rear. And most notably, what you'll see is attacks towards Uspenivka, because this acts as a sort of coordination between all of the Ukrainian defensive nodes in the region. And you can see how there could be a potential for a converging between the front lines coming from the south in Vuhledar and from the southeast in Konstantinivka. So that's just one perspective on it. But then, of course, you have a lot of these other rural areas a bit to the west that would be more susceptible to attacks if Vuhledar were to fall. But again, that's looking more long term. So now let's move on to Pokrovsk. Looking at the Pokrovsk theater, we're going to begin by looking at an axis which is actually not pointing towards that particular city. We're zooming in, and it would be more, I guess, apt to say that it's the Krakow front, Vavcha River front, something of that sort, even Selydove front. But to zoom in over here, you can see that the Russian forces over the past 24 hours have been able to advance 6.5 square kilometers, and they've been able to infiltrate through the entirety of Memrik and in the process captured all of it. And looking at the most generous estimate, they've been able to advance around 3.2 kilometers southwards. The capture of Memrik was verified based on this video. It's from the 114th Brigade of the DPR, so the unit that's been involved in a lot of this sort of village hopping, going from village to village that has already been cleared out, the Ukrainians withdrew from, raising flags to confirm Russian presence. And so they did the same thing by raising up one of those flags top of an electrical pole. And so you can see that here in the center of Memrik. And the Russians have not just stopped here, even though it is a really deep salient that is formed as a result. They're just continuing to utilize this sort of gap south of the E50 highway in order to infiltrate towards other Ukrainian villages that are basically surrounded by all these trenches. And the big issue is the Ukrainians aren't able to utilize them to the maximum ability. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, the intention of these trenches was to defend against Russian assaults that were going to come across the river, not coming north from open fields and areas that the Ukrainians don't have many prepared defenses. So the expectation was that the defenses would be used to prevent attacks from these axes that you see marked with the red arrows. But in reality, they're being surprised in coming in from the north. So, of course, the element of surprise is one part, manpower is another part. The fact that even the manpower that is here, they weren't stationed in these trenches before. They were stationed in villages further northwards. And since then, they've been in a state of constant flux, moving from one position to another with constant withdrawal. And they don't have the wherewithal and the coordination between one another to organize a large-scale defense in these various trenches. And even if they were able to, they would be defending with their backs towards the river here. And so they'd be defending a very narrow corridor when you look at it, basically a corridor of 1.5 kilometers, while they're coming under really extreme Russian momentum. And so it's just simply not possible. And so the Russian forces understand that a lot of these strongholds, they're basically unmanned because the Ukrainian forces are still trying to scramble in reinforcements, and then in the process they don't have enough to put them into certain areas that are closer to the line of contact. And so you could see that with some of these defenses here, we don't really know if there are Ukrainians left here. And if there aren't, then the Russian reconnaissance will notify the ground squads about that, and they'll try to advance and clear those particular areas out. And the Russians, of course, they will be utilizing the local tree lines, and also they have paved roads leading directly into a lot of these villages, like Karlivka from the north, like this village here, Dolinivka. Lisivka is also really close to where the Russians are located at. So all these villages now are in imminent danger. When it comes to Lisivka, the Russian forces are basically advancing parallel to this line of trenches. But again, due to how close it is to the line of contact and the Russian momentum, which means that there's a lag when we look at the publicly available information about Russian advances and what's going on in reality, it means that Lisivka, of course, is very close to the front line, and by extension, Ukrainsk, which is another really important village in this region, one of the more important out of the ones that I've just read out near this river, the Vavcha River. Ukrainsk is important because it serves as a staging area, and it's located on a really highly elevated ridge. And this is ridge, if you're going to look out, and I'll show you guys in a second, is an extension of a ridge that the Russians are using to advance through right now. So Ukrainsk, first of all, it has this really important mine over here. I forgot what it's called, but I think it's called like the Selydove mine or Pivnichkaya Selydove mine. That's something to that effect. And so this mine over here and its Terracon are on really high elevation, overlooking a lot of the positions actually to the northwest in Selydove, and even overlooking some of the ridges through which the Russians and the Ukrainians are currently operating. So just to give you guys an idea of that ridge, I've continually mentioned it, but that's because the Russians are making an effort to advance specifically through this axis. And it makes so much sense because then they're able to more effectively squeeze out Ukrainians from villages and nearby defensive nodes. And so it sort of starts in Mykolaiivka, as you may know, and then goes all the way south to Mimrik. So Mimrik is actually on high elevation. It sort of extends to the southeastwards into this direction here along the E50 highway. It also extends in the southwestern direction, and so this height also engulfs Ukrainsk, and then sort of takes this left turn and is basically really all over the fields south of Selydove. And so you have this really highly elevated area south of Selydove in this region that it just is not filled with any trenches or any settled area. And then going southwards along the river, these are also highly elevated areas, including Hirnik. And then going even further southwards, you have the climax, which is this just massive hill. It's basically like a plateau, and it includes then nearby a couple of terracons. And this just gives complete domination for the Ukrainians over basically the maybe 10-kilometer radius surrounding the height over here. So it includes cities like Krakow that are on low-lying elevation, and includes the approaches from the east, northeast, etc. And so it really is an important vector, and the Russians are closing in on it. Not the immediate threat. The immediate threat is, of course, to the villages here, but also to the heights nearby. So those ones are, of course, under threat, and that includes Ukrainsk. The fall of Ukrainsk will, again, unlock an opportunity for the Russians to undermine the entirety of this line of defense, the southeastern perimeter for Selydove. Not necessarily because they need this in order to take Selydove, because we're going to get to how they're advancing directly through the city in a second, but to take over nearby villages like Tsukyurnoi, which I believe is in a high elevated area, but some of the nearby towns actually are on low elevation. And just as an example, this entire area northwest of Selydove is just low-lying valley, really low-lying valley running through here, including Toretsk, because it's all along that same river, Salona River, I think it's called. So they're on the same river valley. And so there are a bunch of other strategic targets here that would allow the Russians to develop a very strong northern flank in order to then advance southwards and eventually take over the massive plateau that I was talking about. And of course, if we're looking in the big picture, the goal of that would be to, of course, take out Krakow, ensure that it can no longer be used by the Ukrainians, and that they can't use the perimeter to the south of it with all those trenches. But also to look in the western direction, you can see that the Russian advances here in the horizontal area, they amount to 2.4 kilometers. So they are advancing now past the E50 highway here. They took over this intersection that leads into Mykolaiivka, and that includes advancing through Centralna Avenue. And so now the Russian forces here are in control of Mikhailivka. That's the name of the village. And there are some reports claiming that they are in control of around 75% of this eastern outskirts of Selydove. I can't confirm that for sure, but based on what's available, they've been able to enter into the first dachas, and most of the dachas are by now abandoned by the Ukrainians. They don't have the means to defend them, and so whatever garrison is here has fallen back to the actual city. And so now the information is also that the main Russian attack axis is basically occurring with direct fire support from the nearby Terracon the Russians captured over the past 2 days. The Russians are advancing with first DRG groups and then perhaps even some stormtroopers in this western direction towards this other Terracon. This Terracon in the nearby mine, this would be the nail in the coffin for Selydove if it were to fall so quickly, because at that point you have this other high elevated point, which gives the Russians a really, really direct, more direct than I've been saying for any other example, just immediate on-looking position towards everything that's going on within the Salona River Valley, with all the houses, even with the apartment buildings and factories, whatever it may be. Some really good staging points for the Ukrainians, but you can't really be sure about it when you have knocking on your northeastern doorstep this really massive Russian presence that's potentially brewing right now. And so the information is that the Russian DRGs are attacking towards this area. Some Russian sources claim they've already taken it over, but again, that's unverified. And then zooming in, there's also local reports of general DRG presence in the stadium area. But again, when we're saying DRGs, it means that the front line has not shifted to such an extent that we could say the Russians control this area. It means that forward elements have already penetrated and are making the preparations for larger assaults in those areas. So then it becomes concerning that the Ukrainians are not able to fully cordon off their eastern perimeter and that there are already reports of infiltrations. It could show that whatever garrison here is not prepared for an extended fight to prevent the Russians from taking it over entirely. Because based on the way that this is going, both in terms of the flanks, which could be a massive threat in the future, but also in terms of how quickly the Russians are pushing through the houses directly, it's really different than many of the other cities that the Russians have been forced to grind through in other engagements, even in this part of the front line. Like in Avdiivka, most of the fighting was on the outskirts, but then again, that to conduct numerous preparations for that. Same thing can be said for Selydove because of the hectic nature in which the situation has developed for the worse here. And so now the Ukrainians are announcing the evacuation, mandatory evacuation of Selydove and various other villages nearby. But at this point, it's so close to the front line that, it should have been done way earlier. So it's just an admission of what we already knew. Then going a bit northwards, we're going to look at situation around Novohordivka because there is information about Russian forces expanding control in the southern part of Novohordivka. The Ukrainians no longer have a presence in this southern, more rural region. Maybe they have a presence here in this small outskirt region, which includes just some farms, and then southwards they may still have a presence in Marinivka, but this is disputed by some Russian sources, claiming that due to the combined pressure from three axes, they've been forced out, the Ukrainians, they've been squeezed out and have withdrawn westwards towards positions on the heights along the E50 highway north of Selydove. But there aren't many static defensive positions here. It's just tree lines, but no trenches there. So then it presents an issue. Once Novohordivka is fully solidified, the Russians will have a rather easy time crossing over and overrunning those positions with the support of firepower. And so that could, of course, have an effect on Selydove, but also an effect on the defense line that is located southeast of Pokrovsk that is trying to defend the perimeter of that said city. So just keep an eye for that in the future. As we're looking northwards at Novohordivka, the Russians are now making efforts to fully clear out the northwestern portion, which is sort of separated from the entirety of the town. And so now you can see, based on this latest update, that they've been able to capture 0.7 square kilometers. This includes a really massive region. You can see here some of the houses, and nearby this really large Terekon and mine facility the Russians have captured. So the Ukrainians may retain some presence in a few houses here, but really is minimal because most of their forces that were here, they've just made the decision to withdraw already to the defense line with all these trenches that are supposed to connect into a sort of semicircle shape. An area where that may not be the case yet is with this Terekon over here. This one is sort of protruding, and there's still no confirmation. The Russians have squeezed out the Ukrainians, but clearly the situation is not favorable for the defenders here. And so the Russians being able to capture two large Terekons in quick succession, so close to this trench, that would be a huge loss for the Ukrainians. It would mean that the Russians have ability to overlook all of the new Ukrainian lines that they've only now been able to enter and try to organize, and that will play a big role in helping the Russians eventually infiltrate past these defensive lines. And that could definitely be done through this rail axis. Something that's been really spreading murmurs from Russian sources is that they're operating in the southern outskirts of Myrnohrad. Now, Myrnohrad, as you may know, it's a vertical city in nature, really extends a lot southwards. And so when we say that they're operating in the southern outskirts, we're talking about an area like this. Now, this is not verified. There's no proof of this yet. It's just rumors that are coming out. But in order for the rumor to be true, it would imply the Russians have already broken past the defense line, either from this axis over here along this sort of branching out rail routes, or from Mykolaiivka. Those would be my two guesses. But again, that's something that we have to wait before I can say with any definitive statements. Looking a bit to the north, you could see just general gray zone around Mykolaiivka, Krasny Yar, Kruty Yar, because the Ukrainians once again have withdrawn to the nearby trenches, something that is more favorable for them. but of course, losing nearby heights is the big drawdown, but they don't have much leeway when it comes to holding on to certain positions due to the sort of large envelopments that could form. Now, 78th Jaeger Brigade, or 71st Brigade, I should say, they have released this interesting video from August 28th, and it shows them conducting shelling on Russian assault squads that are advancing towards Krasny Yar. And so, first of all, cluster shelling, of course, DPICMs on nearby tree lines where the Russians are pushing through, drones dropping grenades, of course, and so there could be casualties caused by this. And so the Russian forces clearly are utilizing the natural foliage from this tree line here to make their way into Krasny Yar near the Zhuravka River. And this video being released by the 71st Brigade confirms that at least a certain portion of this unit has been moved back to the Pokrovsk direction. Now, if you may recall, when the front line opened in Vovchansk, this was one of the notable units that I said was moved away from the Avdiivka/Pokrovsk sector to help the Ukrainians defend against the Russian pushes in Liptsy and Vovchansk. And over the past 2-3 months, it's been operating there and has had a lot of proof of that. But recently, they've basically dialed down their frequency of uploads of videos, and now for the first time, they're uploading again footage from this part of the front line. Very clearly, they've been moved back, and this is something that I think is going to be a trend that the Ukrainians now, they have this large core of actually experienced units that are defending in Liptsy and Vovchansk, and a lot of them could be of really big need for the Ukrainians elsewhere. And that could include Kursk, for instance, if the Ukrainians want to continue either solidify or expand into Glushkovo district, their offensive. But also with an area like this, where the 71st Brigade already has a lot of experience, it just seems logical that they be moved back eventually, given how the Russian offensive has died down in the Vovchansk region. So this is just an extra, perhaps 2,000 men to fill in some gaps. Then, of course, once again, rumors from the Russian side, which are unverified, of the capture of eastern Hordivka, with the Russians claiming, some of them at least, that there was a withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces across the Zhuravka River in this region. The Zhuravka River is here, and so the western bank is in this X region. Baraibar, for instance, they basically mimic the same mapping that I still have over here, so keep that in mind. And yeah, that's in terms of the changes, all that's occurred over the past 24 hours. A lot of rumors spiraling. And that's what happens when you have such a quick pace of Russian advances. People either get ahead of themselves or they're leaking information that hasn't been publicly verified yet, but maybe will be soon. Now, in terms of the troop concentrations, I really want to focus on this because this could shed some light into sort of the future dynamics in the Donbass more generally. And so just to begin, I'm going to look at the Ukrainian forces position in the southern theater of this front line, because we're going to divide up the front into, I'll say 4 sectors basically. Southern sector, which is the region that's between Mimrik to Karlivka, and I know it's hard to see because of all the markers, but we'll zoom in. The Selydove region, which is basically over here. The Novohorodivka/Hrodivka region, which is basically this diagonal line. And then the northern flank, which is this final one that is located to the north. Now I'm going to go through and list the presence of every single unit in these 4 regions. First of all, southern region, you have presence of 59th, 56th, and 68th Brigades. You can see all of them marked over here on my map. And for instance, with the 59th Brigade, certain battalions aren't necessarily defending in an area like this where the red line is located. They're more so defending around Novelska or even the Krasnohorivka area. But yeah, generally they have at least 1 battalion in this particular region. So it could be within the ballpark of 5,000 to 6,000 troops that the Ukrainians have. And they're not all fighting at the line of contact, obviously, but at least on paper, they should be floating around this general region. Looking a bit westwards at the Selydove front, this is an area that I do think needs to be beefed up when it comes to manpower. This is actually the weakest spot in the entire Ukrainian line, which really shows you guys how little they were worried about it even a month ago. So here you have the 117th Brigade, and this is important because this unit was previously defending for so long around Vodyane before, and even before that, it was involved in the counteroffensive, and so it's had all that experience in that one region, and now for the first time, it's been moved elsewhere, and it's been replaced by a lower quality force in Zaporozhye / the Orikhiv sector, specifically the 141st Infantry Brigade. So this is the replacement in Robotyne, while this unit has been moved to a more important part of the front line. And you're seeing that a lot with Zaporozhye. Ukrainians moving forces away from there because it's simply not needed. The offensive has been over for a very long time, and filling the gaps there with the lower quality conscript units that have formed over the past year or so. And so this is just one example, but you also have the 15th National Guard Brigade, which also operated around Orikhiv and is generally in this Selydove sector. And you perhaps also have the 78th Hertz Regiment, because they do have from this summer a casualty report from this general region, that a soldier that died in Selydove. And so that could be an indication that certain elements of this unit are actually now defending in Selydove. But just to keep in mind, this regiment has split off. Some units are operating in Toretsk, some units are operating in Kursk, so it's not entirely clear. So let's just say 4 to 4.5 thousand operating in Selydove, which is definitely not sufficient at this point, given the pace of the Russian advances deep into that city. Looking a bit northwards at Novohordivka/Hordivka, this is again really important, more so the axis meant to defend Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad directly. Here you have a litany of units. You have 25th Airborne Brigade, 71st Jaeger Brigade, as we just said, 2nd National Guard Brigade, so another one of these National Guard units moved in recently. 47th, I can't believe I didn't even mention them, really are the linchpin of the defense here for the Ukrainians, really important unit for them. You have the 113th Territorial Defense Brigades, 125th Territorial Defense Battalion. It's been confirmed that they're operating around here just to give extra manpower. And so they're involved with the defense generally in the sector. You have the Birds of Magyar Air Reconnaissance Group, but in recent months, it's been changed to the 414th, I think, Airborne Regiment, something of that sort. I think it's actually in the Ukrainian Marine Corps, but it's more so involved with ground-based operations, just using drones. Had a lot of experience with Marine brigades in Kherson, but has now been split off and is defending in this same Hordivka region. You also have the 151st Mechanized Brigade, formed, I think, in October of 2023, plus the 35th National Guard Regiment. That's the unit that's been releasing a lot of footage. A few other units that are sort of basically the remnants of elements, unorganized elements that were defending around Avdiivka. We don't know if they're still operating here or if they're on the rear. For instance, you have the Special Police Regiment of Kiev that had a role in defending in Avdiivka and hasn't been heard from ever since. So I don't think it's fair to mark them because they don't have any proof. And so it's probably around 12,000 based on these numbers if we're adding them up all together with the battalions and the brigades. And so, of course, this is the most copious area of Pokrovsk front, which makes a lot of sense because it is a direct defense that they have. And then looking a bit northwards, controlling the height that is in between the line of contact in the highway connecting to Pokrovsk, you have various units, including the 110th, which is over here, if you guys know, 111th Territorial Defense Brigade. You have this unit, National Guard element, 14th National Guard Brigade. You have 3rd Special Purpose Regiment, which I think is split because it has elements all over the place. May also be operating around Kursk or Velika Novosilka fronts, but also around here. You have 31st Brigade. They have many battalions operating here. 1st Battalion, 3rd Battalion, maybe even one other. And so they definitely have left their mark in this region. And lastly, you have the 401st Rifle Battalion, which is a part of the newly formed Ukrainian 143rd Infantry Brigade. Again, just another one of those forces, units to fill the vacuum. And there are so many other brigades that are in the 140s/150s that have not been committed yet. And I'm really waiting to see when they will be, if ever. And then given the idea of how many armored units they have, if they actually reach the manpower requirements, because definitely the Ukrainians in this region, they don't just need a certain quantity of troops, but it's also about coordinating together the defense between all the brigades in a way that's effective and is able to respond to a Russian force here that is really large. Not just that, but has all the firepower on their side and has experience from advancing here. So it's not just about manpower, but also about the quality, of course. So just sending in artillerymen or repairmen, drone operators to fill in trenches, it's not going to be the same thing as sending in actual experienced forces to man those same static positions. On the Russian side, what I did is I just counted all the units here, looked at whether they were brigades, regiments, and so it's a very unscientific way of estimating the Russian size because, again, so much has changed over the past few months, and some of the unit locations here are a bit outdated, but I think generally my estimate makes sense. And in the future, when I have time, I'll look into it in more detail. But I'm estimating that the Russian garrison, which is generally springing out of Avdiivka, has around 70,000 men. So on the Ukrainian side, when you add it all together, it's around 30,000 defending in the Pokrovsk region. In the Russian side, probably starting in Donetsk and then branching out to Avdiivka, around 70,000, give or take. So it's more than 2 to 1 in that case. And that's actually less than some of the reports from Ukrainian commanders actually at the front line, not talking about all the units on paper, but ground zero, talking about 4 to 1 Russian advantage during their own ground assaults. All right, now let's look at New York. So the Russian forces are continuing to advance westwards from their positions in Yurivka, continuing to take over higher elevated positions near Sukhabalka with the hope of eventually displacing the Ukrainian garrison there. And what they're doing first is just consolidating full control over the heights in between these two chains of villages with the hopes of just completely overlooking all of the surrounding villages that the Ukrainians are still in. So now they've actually made the first deep efforts towards Pantelia Monivka with an advance of 0.9 square kilometers. So again, just chipping away at it. Not a high priority part of the front line at this point in time, but you will see the significance at a later date. I've talked about it a lot, but just to zoom in northwards, you'll see that we have one other video to confirm that there is fighting going on within the center of Toretsk. So it's just a video of the Skala Battalion conducting these nighttime strikes using drones, targeting these various apartment buildings in eastern Toretsk. Again, confirming to us the Russian forces are now turning these into their own firing positions. And Scala confirming that they're not just operating around New York and conducting localized counterattacks there, but they're also involved in defending in the city of Toretsk itself. And yeah, that's all that for today. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.